Morphogenesis means morphe is form, genesis is coming into being. Morphogenetic fields are fields that shape developing organisms, the form. I mean, the area that concerns me most is the habitual thinking in science. The paradigm of mechanistic materialism is the dominant worldview for more than 100 years in the sciences. And that says that nature is mechanical, that matter is unconscious, the whole universe is like a great machine. What is this ever accelerating expansion of the universe doing? What it's doing is speeding up evolution, because the whole evolution of the cosmos depends on the expansion, which gives an arrow to time. The ultimate arrow of time in the universe is the expansion of the cosmos. And it literally creates more space for new things to happen. That everything was fixed at the moment of the Big Bang. That's the standard assumption within science, which is really a relic of this Platonic worldview.
Yeah.
And the point I make there is that if we live in a radically evolutionary universe, which we do, then why should the laws of nature all be fixed in advance? Why can't they evolve like everything else? I think horizontal time is not illusory. I think the universe is expanding, which is creating more time, as it were, as it does that. There's also this vertical aspect, which comes about through mystical experiences most powerfully, where people feel that their mind is part of something much greater than themselves, which gives the impression of being timeless or not in time as we normally know it.
Welcome, dear viewers, to another episode of the Book LuMens podcast. I don't know how to translate that into English, but you might wonder why I'm talking in English, and that's because Joey and I took the train to London from Amsterdam yesterday to meet up with a very special man. He got his TED Talk banned, and the Sunday Times even called him a prophet of our times. Now, tada! We've entered the library of the one and only Rupert Sheldrake. Thank you very much for having us, Rupert.
Good that you're here.
Yeah, I'm very excited because last year we did an interview with a friend of yours, Pim van Lommel, and the two of you made a really big difference in my personal life. And I'll explain later, but we have a few household things to mention first before we start. If you like this video, if you think it's valuable, please give it a like or leave a comment below the video. You can also do that on our website, tijdboeklumens.nl. You can subscribe to this channel, you can subscribe to our newsletter, and if you want to give us a reward or a donation, we would be very happy to receive that. That is what's keeping us going. All right. Yeah, so what your work has meant to me personally, like for instance your work on telepathy, to prove that, opened up a whole new world for me, like a whole new dimension of reality. And I did a technical studies in Delft, mechanical engineering, very solid. I was raised as a Christian until I was 16. I left that behind. So because of your work and of Pim van Lommel, I finally could open up that there's more than just a three-dimensional world. And I think I owe my whole life path after that towards work from people like you. So I'm super excited to be here. And I'm also not surprised that a platform such as the Sunday Times calls you a prophet. Because to me, that's what a prophet does, to bring people into bigger realities towards truth. But how do you feel to be called a prophet?
I don't really know. I don't think about it, actually. I'd forgotten I'd been called a prophet. Well, what I'm trying to do is see the way that things might go within science and in other areas, and do my best to change things in a direction that I think is better than the way we're going at the moment.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's what we're all trying to do. But so much confusion about what is the right direction. So many opinions in our world. You know, we don't have a lot of time for this interview, I understand. So I've been thinking about what to address, because we can go into so many directions with you. So the telepathy or the morphogenetic fields and the morphogenetic resonance, the memory of space. But I think what would be most interesting to start with is your views on the collective consciousness. How do people, organisms influence each other? How does it work, and what are your findings? Like, how did you come to such a conclusion?
Well, the idea of morphic resonance suggests that every species has a collective memory. And that's more, I suppose, about collective unconsciousness than consciousness, because habits are reinforced by morphic resonance, and habits are usually unconscious. So we're all influenced by unconscious habits. We're all creatures of habit. Most of our behavior is habitual. Most of our mental life is unconscious. And there, I think morphic resonance plays a very large role. It's similar to what the psychologist Jung called the collective unconscious, with the collective memory. So we're influenced by all sorts of habits, cultural habits, linguistic habits, habits of thought. Within science, paradigms, models of reality are really habits of thinking. So all of that is very much influenced by morphic resonance. Then, of course, there's the conscious part of our lives, which is influenced by not just morphic resonance, by media, social media, you know, all the normal things, newspapers, the weather. I mean, lots of things influence collective consciousness, and far too complicated to enumerate them all.
Yeah.
But my emphasis is mainly on the role of morphic resonance in our habits of thought.
Yeah, and could you give an example of where you found this collective consciousness to be super clear?
Well, I mean, it's clear in any area where there are habitual thinking. For example, I mean, the area that concerns me most is the habitual thinking in science. The paradigm of mechanistic materialism is the dominant worldview for more than 100 years in the sciences. And that says that nature is mechanical, that matter's unconscious, the whole universe is like a great machine, living organisms are mechanisms. So this is a very deep-seated habit of thought.
Yeah.
And it impinges on the way people respond. Say, take telepathy, which you mentioned earlier. Most people have experienced telepathy in connection with telephone calls.
Yeah.
Many people have experienced it with their pets, their dogs or cats. As you know, I wrote a book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, about telepathy in animals. So here there's massive experience and of this. Millions of people in the Netherlands and everywhere else experience this on a daily basis. Yet, as soon as you step into a scientific institution or an academic institution, there's a taboo against this being real, because the mechanistic worldview says that the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain, and it's all inside the head. Therefore, my thoughts can't possibly influence you hundreds of kilometers away, because at most there's some weak electrical impulse that you could just about detect with electrodes on the scalp. But there's no possible way I could influence you hundreds of miles away. Therefore, all this evidence, all this experience which people have is illusory. So now many people in the scientific world just immediately assume it's illusory and refuse to look at the evidence or dismiss it as fraudulent or statistical errors or something like that. Now, why do they do that? It's not because they've carefully studied the evidence or they've thought about their own experience. It's because there's a standard pattern of thought that says this doesn't fit in to the existing worldview, therefore it can't be true. So this is, another word is prejudice, but this is deeply entrenched in the thinking of many scientists, not because they've really thought about it, but because they haven't thought about it, because it's a kind of cultural or social habit.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's just one of countless possible examples of where habitual thinking shapes the way people react.
And it's very recognizable. But how can you, like, do you need to reach a certain tipping point to flip over the habit? And then, like, what's the percentage of people you need to switch, or what is your view on that?
Well, I mean, if you take the population as a whole, if you took a poll of everyone in the Netherlands or everyone in Britain, and say, do you think telepathy is possible? Have you experienced it? The great majority of people would say yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if it requires like a majority vote, we've already got a majority vote. But within the academic world, then the opinion is very negative about these things. It's not just people who are professional scientists or professional academics. It's people who want to be seen as educated. You see, the normal view is that uneducated people believe all these stupid things, but educated people are so smart they've seen through it.
Yeah.
And so it's mostly people who want to preserve their credentials as being educated.
Yeah.
So I think one thing that would change it is a change in worldview. If instead of being something that seems to violate rational science, we have a model of the mind or of nature where this becomes perfectly normal, then most people would relax and they'd be able to accept something that basically they already know.
Yeah. Because I think in this particular case, people have something at stake to switch over to a different point of view. Because they've built their whole identity upon a certain dogma.
Yes.
And that's the threshold. But in nature, like with animals, like there are so many stories like the 100 monkey effect, or a certain bird which discovers to break open a nut, and then all of a sudden all around the world the same type of bird starts to break open nuts in the same way. Like, well, can you give an example of how that works?
Well, this is any spread of behavior that, I mean, the best example from over the 20th century is blue tits, small birds, which steal cream from the top of milk bottles.
Yeah.
I mean, here in Britain, we have deliveries of milk bottles to the doorstep. I mean, it still happens. I mean, we have them here at our house in London. And when I first started living here about 35 years ago, we had full-fat milk delivered to the doorstep, and most mornings when I go there, I'd find that the aluminium top had been broken open and some of the cream had disappeared.
Yeah.
These small birds were stealing the cream.
Yeah.
Well, this habit started around year 1920 in Southampton, in the south of England. And at the time, amateur bird spotters all over the country took part in a national experiment organized by Cambridge University to track this new behavior. And they found that it spread locally, but then it showed up 70 or 80 kilometers away, and these birds don't move more than a few kilometers from home. So they thought these must be independent discoveries. And they tracked the independent discovery, and the rate of independent discovery accelerated. So it was accelerating in a way that couldn't just be explained by the birds flying and telling other birds about it.
Yeah.
And the people who were doing this were not trying to prove morphic resonance, so they were just interested in bird behavior.
Empirical.
So they had it was purely empirical. They had no theory to explain this.
Yeah.
And then during the Second World War, the delivery of milk stopped because of the war, and blue tits only lived for a few years. So after the war, there wouldn't have been any blue tits that still remembered the golden age of free cream before the war. And yet the habit started again all over Britain, and the same happened in the Netherlands. After the war, it started again very rapidly in the Netherlands. So here we have the spread of a habit that could have been because of morphic resonance, the collective memory in these birds. Incidentally, it's now stopped because so many people, including us, who switched over to semi-skimmed milk, that it's not worth them opening the bottles to get. There's no cream anymore at the top of the milk bottle, so the habit has more or less died out because of the change in people's dietary habits of semi-skimmed milk. I never find our milk bottles have been attacked, but there are plenty of blue tits who are still around, so I see them in our garden. So here we've got an evolution of a habit, and then it's gone away because the conditions have changed.
That's so funny. So yeah, I just wonder then, like, how does reality work in this way? Like, can you give a description on what the mechanism is? Or now I use the word mechanism, but
well, there you are. That's a habit.
Yeah, mechanical engineer.
Yes. Well, I think morphic resonance is the influence of similar patterns of activity on subsequent similar patterns across time and space. And it works in self-organizing systems, which include molecules, crystals, cells, plants, animals, societies of animals. It doesn't include machines, computers, tables, chairs, bicycles, cars, which are not self-organizing. They're made in factories. You don't grow a computer in a garden, you make it in a factory. So machines, which have been taken by the mechanistic worldview to be the principal model for all of nature, are the very worst examples because they're fully determinate systems in which morphic resonance doesn't happen. But in self-organizing systems, there's an influence on the basis of similarity across time and space. Now, you might say, well, you did say, what's the mechanism? Well, nobody knows. There's a variety of suggestions as to how this could happen. The quantum physicist David Bohm thought that it happened through what he calls the implicate order. The implicate order was an invisible realm that underlies quantum phenomena. And he thought the implicate order had a kind of memory, so what's happened in one place can influence what happens in another. Some physicists think that this might happen through some of the extra dimensions in superstring theory. In the 1920s, some people suggested telepathy and phenomena like that happened because there might be an extra dimension. And then people say, oh, it's rubbish, there can't be any extra dimensions. But now extra dimensions come cheap. There are 11 dimensions in M theory. 10 in superstring theory. So there's all these extra dimensions. And so some physicists say, well, we've got all these extra dimensions. They might be doing something. They might be doing something that wouldn't happen with just 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. And one thing that they think they might be doing is connecting things up across space and time, leading to morphic resonance. So that's possible. I mean, I don't understand superstring theory, and nor do most people, because it's based on complex mathematics beyond most of us. So, you know, if somebody says, oh, and then there are other physical theories of morphic resonance. I mean, people send them to me by email. I get several a year that physicists come up with, and on about the second line of the paper you start into the equations, and it'd probably be fine for you with your mechanical engineering upbringing, but for most people, they don't follow it. So when people say, what's the mechanism? If there was an agreed mechanism, I handed them a paper full of mathematical equations, they wouldn't understand a word of it. So in a sense, they don't really want to know what the mechanism is. They want to know whether it's approved of by scientific authorities or something like that.
Right.
So the reason I don't think it matters very much, strangely, it may sound strange, is that I think what really matters is whether this happens or not. That's what preoccupies me. It is what's the evidence? Does it really happen? Does morphic resonance really happen? And you see, if you take the analogy with magnetic and electric phenomena, in the 1840s here in London, Michael Faraday was doing experiments on electricity and magnetism. He developed the idea of the electromagnetic field. And he showed how electricity and magnetism are related, and from which we get the electric motor and so many aspects of modern life. but he couldn't explain these fields. He didn't know how to explain them. And then Maxwell came along 20 years later, and with his equations of electromagnetism, which were based on the idea that electromagnetic waves, light, and other electromagnetic waves propagate through a tenuous form of matter called the ether. So the theory was all based on the ether. Then in 1905, Einstein came along and said, there's no such thing as the ether. You just have electromagnetic fields which are free-floating. They're not based on anything else. They're just themselves.
Yeah.
And then people say, well, how can that be? They must be based on something. And then in quantum electrodynamics, people come along and say, well, actually, there's a quantum vacuum field and all electromagnetic interactions depend on virtual photons, but you can't actually see them or detect them because they're virtual. So we now have a theory that's totally different from anything that Faraday could have conceived of. And the theories of electromagnetism have changed over the years, but electric motors go on working irrespective of the theory.
Yeah.
So with morphic resonance, I think there'll probably be many possible theories to explain it, but the most important thing is to find out empirically what's happening, whether it really does happen, and what its implications are.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because it meant so much for me to have a understanding with the mind, so it could relax and to surrender to bigger realities.
Oh yeah, well, I'm all in favour of understanding. I mean, I spend lots of time thinking about these things, and I'd be very happy if there is a credible model. I mean, there already are several credible models, but at the moment, when you have different models of morphic resonance, like implicate order or multiple dimensions in M theory, it's hard to know which one's the better model because they don't make different predictions. If there are models that make different experimental predictions, you could then test between the models and find out which is the best one. We haven't got to that stage yet.
Yeah, what we've gotten to with our podcast series until now was quite a few times that by diving deep in, we found God to be behind all of it. And from that point of view, all other things come into such another light. So it helps so much, in my case at least, to have this understanding of at least the deepest truth, to use that view on different areas of life. So there's so much distortion in the world and confusion. And we believe, or we know, that by going to the source of everything, we can become one again, you know? So you're a scientist and we travel here to have your view on reality. But in the end, what we're striving towards is unity, to leave behind this duality we live in. And it's created, it's where we can play, but it's also where we can drown in suffering and in war and fighting against each other. So that's why we want to deep dive in to understand, and because we're still separated from other groups, and we believe that if we have an understanding and a support of what we believe, then people can relax more and then we can listen more to each other. So that's why I like to ask about.
Well, that's fine. I'm perfectly happy with you asking about it.
Yeah. And earlier you mentioned about the habits, and also in your band TED Talk, you talk about these habits instead of the constants of the universe. Now, well, I did the technical studies, and the constants are constant, they're a given, and everything is deduced from that given. But it's a wonder if it's really constant all the time, and it's so specifically, accurately that life can exist, and if the constants would be a little bit different, everything would implode or explode. And your view on the habits makes such more sense, also from our view from God. You know, God created the universe and is learning by doing, and is growing and evolving. But also from a scientific point of view, like from the Big Bang, of course, it had to evolve. But how did you come to that view? Because from a scientific point of view, to come to that conclusion, that's quite a long road, I think.
Well, I came to it through working at Cambridge on the development of plants. I was a botanist. I was working on developmental biology in plants. And technically, I was working on the way in which the plant hormone auxin, which chemically is indole acetic acid, it's the main plant hormone. I was working on how it's produced in plants and how it moves around the plant. And I worked out how it's produced. It's produced by dying cells as a breakdown product of cells as they die. And inside plants, there are many dying cells. All the wood cells, for example, in a tree trunk or in the veins of leaves, are dead. These are tubes, little tubes that conduct water. And to become a dead, empty tube, the cell has to thicken up the wall, and then it commits suicide. As it commits suicide, it dissolves its own proteins. It dissolves itself. As it dissolves the proteins, all the amino acids are released. Then they're broken down. And one of the breakdown products of the amino acid tryptophan is indole acetic acid. So it's made by dying cells. I worked that out. Then it's moved around the plant always towards the roots. It moves down towards the root tips. It doesn't move in the other direction. It's called the polar auxin transport system. And with a colleague at Cambridge, I worked out how that happens. I won't go into all the technical details, but anyway, here we were, this was in the 1970s, that people working on animal development didn't know what the chemicals were that were involved in the development. We knew much more in plants than people did in animals at that time. And this was a big triumph, and it was, major discovery and all that. But then when I thought about it, I thought, well, actually, all plants, ferns and palms and foxgloves and cabbages, all make auxin in the same way. They all move it around with the same transport system, and yet they all have different shapes. And the leaves have different shapes from the flowers, and within the flowers, the petals have different shapes from the stamens, and so on. So this isn't going to explain how all these shapes are different, because it's the same thing in all cases. It's a bit like saying you can understand the economy of the Netherlands by analysing euro coins and notes and things. Well, every economic transaction involves euros, at least virtual euros, but it won't tell you all the different economic activities. It won't give you any details of, steel businesses, car businesses, flower growing businesses. They're all different.
Got it.
So the chemistry of the notes or the nature of the euro won't explain it. So something else is going on. And then I discovered in the 1920s, biologists had, working on development, had proposed that there are invisible fields, morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields, that shape organisms as they develop, as a kind of mold or blueprint, like an architectural plan.
For those who don't know what morphogenetic field is, can you explain that?
Morphogenesis means morphe is form, genesis is coming into being. Morphogenetic fields are fields that shape developing organisms, the form. So the morphogenetic field of a leaf would be a kind of shaping or mold of a leaf. Or
where the leaf grows into.
It grows into a kind of plan of the leaf. And the morphogenetic field of a petal or of a liver or of an eye would be like a plan into which the system grows. So fields are regions of influence in space. A magnetic field is inside a magnet, but it's also around it. It gives a shape to the space around the magnet, a shape to the magnetic influence around the magnet. So the gravitational field of the Earth is in the Earth, but invisibly stretches out beyond it, keeping the Moon in its orbit. So fields are an important concept in science that are not made of matter. Instead, matter's made of fields, according to modern science. So, an electron is a vibratory pattern of activity in an electron field. So this is in itself somewhat counterintuitive, because most people think of matter as solid, hard stuff. But actually, within modern physics, matter is thought of as vibratory patterns within fields. So the idea was, in addition to the nuclear fields, the quantum matter fields, the electromagnetic fields and the gravitational fields that are already part of standard physics, there are other kinds of fields which shape form in self-organizing systems, morphogenetic fields. So this idea, I didn't invent this idea, it was already part of biology, but very much a minority view, because it's a holistic view of a top-down causation. The field shapes the organism, whereas the spirit of modern biology since the 1950s and 60s has been strongly reductionist. You explain everything in terms of the smallest parts, genes, molecules, and try and explain life from the bottom up, from the small. Molecular biology has become the most dominant part of biology, trying to explain things from the bottom up. It's like trying to explain a building by analyzing the bricks and the cement and the iron, the steel beams and that kind of thing. I mean, it's important. You need to know about that, but it doesn't tell you the building plan, the architectural plan, which is a top-down cause.
Yeah.
So anyway, I realized that we needed something like that. But then the question is, how could these fields be inherited? Because they're not genes, they're not proteins. Genes code for the structure of proteins, the sequence of amino acids. There's no way they could be inherited like that. And yet they had to evolve. Most of my colleagues who were interested in morphogenetic fields, like the biologist Brian Goodwin, for example, here in Britain, thought that the key way forward was to find mathematical equations that described them, taking the standard physics view that what's really real is mathematical equations, and the world is just a kind of instantiation of equations. Now, most theoretical physicists and mathematicians believe that maths is more real than reality as we experience it. They're basically crypto-Platonists. They believe that there's a kind of eternal realm that's more true and more real than the world we actually inhabit. Well, I'm not a crypto-Platonist and I'm not a mathematician. So I thought and in biology, everything evolves. So it's no use having eternal equations for dinosaurs that were all there at the moment of the Big Bang, or for rose leaves. It just didn't seem to be a plausible explanation. So then I'd been reading a book about memory by the French philosopher Henri Bergson, where he postulates that memory involves causation across time, across gaps in time. And then I had a sudden moment of insight that if these fields were inherited directly across time on the basis of similarity, then large amounts of biology would become much easier to understand, inheritance and evolution. And that really led to the idea of morphic resonance. So it came about through thinking about plant form, in answer to your question. And it didn't come from reading a sort of Oriental philosophy or esoteric studies or anything like that. It came from Western philosophy, particularly Bergson. I later discovered that the idea fitted very well with Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. And I later worked in India, and I spent 7 years in India. And I found that in Indian philosophy and in Buddhist philosophy, the idea of a kind of memory in nature is completely standard. Most people think that's perfectly normal, whereas in the West they don't. It's a big cultural difference.
Yeah, exactly. People claim that science is objective, but it's so subjective. It's very relative towards the local culture.
Yes, well, our culture, you see, is very strong. Our scientific culture is very strongly shaped by the Platonic or Pythagorean tradition, which is what gives rise to the idea that all the laws of nature must have been there at the moment of the Big Bang because they're eternal, and that the constants are constant, and that everything was fixed at the moment of the Big Bang. That's the standard assumption within science, which is really a relic of this Platonic worldview. And the point I make there is that if we live in a radically evolutionary universe, which we do, then why should the laws of nature all be fixed in advance? Why can't they evolve like everything else? And actually, the whole idea of laws of nature is anthropocentric. Only humans have laws. In fact, only civilized humans have laws. Tribal societies have customs. So the idea, and human laws do evolve. The laws of Britain today are not the same as the laws 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. But to avoid the extremely anthropocentric nature of laws, which implies a legislature imposing laws on the country or the citizens, habit is a much more natural metaphor. And so I think actually we have habits dependent on memory within nature rather than laws.
And it's a good thing we have that memory, because everything would go into every direction. So we need to have some glue.
Yes, it stabilizes things. Habit is a stabilizing influence.
Yeah, exactly. And so you believe, and that's our view as well, that the universe is evolving in all sorts of ways, but where do you think it's growing towards? Like, what is the end purpose, or where is it going to?
Well, that's difficult to know, isn't it? Because if you take the universe as a whole, it's expanding, and its rate of expansion seems to be increasing. Until about the year 2000, people thought that the expansion was slowing down, and that the universe would stop expanding and then begin to contract under the influence of gravity, and then contract faster and faster until it ended in the opposite of the Big Bang, called the Big Crunch, like a black hole. So that view said everything will end in darkness, in a black hole. If it's expanding, some physicists, like Roger Penrose here in Britain, think that it will expand so much that it's so tenuous, the amount of matter, it's so diluted, that matter will evaporate and everything will end up as light. So we've got two rival theories. One says everything ends in darkness, the other says everything ends in light. But fortunately, we're poised between these two at the moment, and it's not going to end all in light or all in darkness, at least within our lifetimes. So in terms of the biggest picture, what is this ever-accelerating expansion of the universe doing? What it's doing is speeding up evolution, because the whole evolution of the cosmos depends on the expansion, which gives an arrow to time. The ultimate arrow of time in the universe is the expansion of the cosmos. And it literally creates more space for new things to happen. If everything remained at the Big Bang, less than the size of a head of a pin, billions of degrees centigrade, nothing much would happen. As it expands, it cools down, and more possible forms of organization come about. Now, how that applies to our future here on Earth is another question. It seems clear that evolution on Earth, at least from the human point of view, is very closely bound up with consciousness and the evolution of consciousness. Human consciousness is different from that of other animals, partly because we have language and the cumulative building up of knowledge within culture, partly because we now have machines which speed up and increase our impact on the environment. So clearly human consciousness has taken on an important role in the evolution of life on this planet. It may not affect other galaxies or other stars within our own galaxy, but at least locally, human consciousness is clearly a very important factor in our evolution. And where is that leading? I mean, there have been many theories, and you know, the traditional theories in Eastern societies and in ancient Greece are cyclic theories. They say that history moves in cycles. You get the rise of civilizations and their fall. You get in the Hindu view, you get the rise of entire universes and then their dissolution, and then a new universe begins. A cyclic model. And this is tied in with reincarnation, a cyclic model of life. Life just is replaced, it goes on and on in cycles. But the Judeo-Christian model of history is different. It differs from all the other traditional models of history in that it sees the historical process itself as having meaning or significance and moving in a particular direction.
Beautiful.
So for the Jewish people, what history was moving towards the coming of the Messiah and a whole new order of political organization for Jewish people. Mm-hmm. And then for Christians, Jesus was the Messiah, but when he died, then the idea was that it would move towards the kingdom of heaven and the second coming of Jesus. So in the Middle Ages, there were many millenarian movements all over Europe with people proclaiming the coming of a new order of history. Mm-hmm. And then in the 17th century, this was secularized. Sir Francis Bacon here in England and thinkers elsewhere in Europe had the idea that through human science, technology, and economic growth, they didn't use those words, but that's what they were talking about, the whole earth would be transformed through human activity and creativity and scientific and technical invention, and economic growth would transform the planet. Well, they were right, and this is now the ideology of every government in the world. Yeah. Economic growth through science and technology. Yeah. So it's progress. It's called progress, and progress means moving forward, but it means moving forward towards a goal. And no one any longer has any idea what the goal is, because it's just more progress. You know, what's the goal of economic growth? It's more economic growth. Yeah. What's the goal of scientific and technical innovation? It's more scientific and technical innovation. Yeah. So we're now caught in a kind of accelerating process that's hurtling towards some goal which we don't know what it is. And now more and more people think that actually what will happen is some kind of disaster or series of disasters. So we haven't really got, you say, when people remove the ideal, the secularization of European society, which is much more advanced than any other part of the world. I mean, secularization, the removal of traditional religious goals and aims and objectives, been replaced by these secular, scientific and technological ones, which are just more of the same and more rational and scientific and technical understanding. Yeah. Now, insofar as we have a goal of moving to a fairer, juster, more equal society, this really comes from a kind of secularization of Christian ethics. You mean, if you think, where does all this, the movement for all minorities must be included, all sexual preferences must be included within a larger harmonious whole. Mm-hmm. This is really, I think, a secularization of the Christian idea of the coming of the kingdom of heaven. It's taken a kind of social, political form. You don't get anything like that in the Islamic world and in the Hindu world and in the Buddhist world. I mean, you don't have people marching through the streets in most parts of the world, with this very strongly motivated desire to bring about a kind of equality and inclusiveness within society. So I think that's an ethical goal at the moment, which is derived from the Christian tradition. Yeah,
it's very interesting. And that's also, brings me back to the vision of this podcast, to bring people back towards the true essence. And with secularizing these things, in the end, it eats up everything. Mm. I saw a map of the North Sea with planned windmill parks. Because, we need more green power. And I look at the map and I think, are you serious? Like, where do you think this is going? And this is just a drop on a hot plate. This is not even fulfilling the current needs. And where is it growing towards? Like, this is going to eat up everything. Unless, we turn and realize what life is really about. So, I'm fascinated about your conclusions, what your research has brought you.
Well, I myself think that this is a very important part of our nature is the spiritual side of our nature, and that in a secular society where spiritual goals are suppressed or marginalized or at least privatized, so religion and spirituality become at best a kind of private hobby. a bit like breeding gerbils or something. As long as it's harmless and doesn't affect anyone, you can believe what you like and practice any religion you like, however exotic. But the idea of any coherent spiritual vision for the society seems to have disappeared. And except for this agenda of equality of rights and this sort of tremendous, which inspires a lot of people, the idea of fighting for these rights. And so I think that to lead a satisfying life, the spiritual dimension is extremely important, and I think it needs to be recovered. And I think if we were more spiritually satisfied, we'd be less greedy about material needs and feel that we need less and instead of always wanting more.
Yeah, I think you're a very valuable bridge builder in that regard. And your last book is about science and spiritual practices. And it mentions, or it describes 7 spiritual practices, and to bring that towards people who don't really want to go into spiritual stuff, because it's too scary, but to give them the benefits of spiritual practice. But does it bring them back towards the true essence of it?
Well, I think spiritual practices, all of them, bring us into connection with a reality greater than ourselves. That's the point of spiritual practices. And the ones I discuss in my book include meditation, which is very well known now and very widely practiced, and which has physiological effects. All these practices have measurable scientific effects. And gratitude, the practice of gratitude, makes people measurably happier and healthier. Connecting with nature is, now there are people running forest bathing courses and stuff. I mean, a lot of people just like going for walks in the woods, but now you can go on an actual course of forest bathing. And connecting with nature is a very, very important part of people's lives, through parks and countryside and so on. Pilgrimage is one of the practices I'm very keen on. I think that the revival of pilgrimage all over Europe is a really important way of reconnecting with nature and with holy places and with tradition. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, which has grown from 1,000 pilgrims on foot in 1987 to 350,000 in 2019. Wow. A massive growth of pilgrimage. Not all devout Roman Catholics. In fact, I imagine only a minority. In fact, we know that only a minority of the people doing it are devout Roman Catholics. All sorts of people, including atheists, like going on pilgrimages.
Exactly.
It's an expression of a spiritual quest, literal expression of it.
And then it can be as a stepping stone towards deeper insights.
Yes, and for many people it is. It's a way of reconnecting with our own tradition and heritage, because these holy places have been venerated for centuries in Europe. And so I think pilgrimage is very satisfying too. I've been on quite a number of pilgrimages, longer ones and shorter ones. I mean, even one-day pilgrimages can be very helpful.
Very inspiring. So if I look back on my own path, like I needed these things to become more stable in receiving deeper insights. And then I did the plant ceremonies and I could receive it. And I think otherwise I might have been in total resistance against it. And then I would call it a bad experience or so. So it's very valuable, I think. And another thing you mentioned was the coming back of the Messiah, according to the Christian tradition. And so that makes me curious, you being such an open-minded researcher, what is your view on predictions and prophecies? Like, what is your view on the construct of time? Like, is it already in place? Is it already there? And I had my own revelations, which meant the world to me. and I could see into the future. But what is your view from a scientific point of view? Like, how is it possible to look into the future if it's not already here yet?
Well, I mean, there are several possible answers to this. One is that there are short-term ways in which we can feel the future. I mean, this is studied scientifically by parapsychologists, that you can feel what's going to happen with some degree of accuracy over a period of seconds or minutes. Some people have precognitive dreams. You dream of things that are going to happen 2 or 3 days in the future. Animals can feel when an earthquake or a tsunami is about to happen, and there are many examples of animals behaving unusually hours or days before an earthquake or tsunami, so they have a premonition, a feeling of the future. I've written about this in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, because I've been studying animal responses to earthquakes for 25 years. So all of these are fairly short-term. When we come to longer-term visions of the future, then I don't think it's out there already fixed. I think that the future is radically open. I think the whole evolutionary process is about the openness of the future. And in evolution, there's creativity as well as habit. And there are all sorts of new forms of organisms appear all the time, just as in the human realm. There are all sorts of new inventions, new tunes, new books, also all sorts of novelty. Not all of them are successful. I mean, there's at least 1 million books published every year, and very few become bestsellers. Most of them disappear into total obscurity. There's composers and musicians plugging new songs, and very few of them make it into the charts. And every week there are new patents filed for new inventions, and the vast majority you never hear of again. So there's a kind of natural selection. There's more creativity than is actually taken up by through natural selection or economic selection in human societies. So there's always creativity that could go in various directions. Some of it is, which fits in with what's happening now, is selected and becomes habitual. New habits develop. But when we look at the future of human society, or indeed since we now influence the whole planet, then I don't think it's fixed, and I think we're co-creators. I think that we're part of a process of evolving consciousness. But what we think and what we hope for and what we pray for, I think can actually influence what happens.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think it's important for us to think of what kind of future we would actually want. And it's not very easy to come up with that answer. I believe in the power of prayer. I think that when we form intentions or visions, that there's more chance that those will come about than if we don't form them. But what kind of vision we form is important. And many years ago, during the Cold War, some people I knew were organizing a project of praying for peace during the Cold War. And instead of the vague, nebulous idea of peace, it seems so vague, and it was specifically focused on nuclear bases. And each person who was adopted a nuclear base in the Soviet Empire and one in the West. So you had 2 nuclear bases you prayed for. And because the idea is if peace breaks out, those bases would cease to be nuclear bases. So then when we were thinking about how to pray for it, some people said, well, I'm just envisaging, these bases pervaded by light, really bright light filling the places. So then we thought, well, actually, if you envisage that, that's envisaging a nuclear war, because all of these bases would be primary nuclear targets. And what would happen in the event of nuclear war is they would indeed be engulfed by a bright light, namely of a nuclear explosion. So some of us thought it'd be better to imagine these places with long grass there, and sort of imagine the barbed wire around them sort of rusting as the fences fell down and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's actually more what has happened to many of these nuclear bases.
Yeah.
So if we think, what do we actually want? Many people, when they think of the future, think of humans living in harmony with the earth in small communities, growing their own potatoes and things. Well, the only way that could happen is through billions of people dying off, because there's no way the present population of the earth could spread out and live in small farming communities. I mean, if you take the population of Britain, there's no way that 60 million people could disperse into the countryside and each have enough land to have a small farm living in harmony with nature. It's not going to happen.
You did calculations on that? Because I've heard that it's very possible to live like more in balance with nature with 8 billion people on the planet.
Well, I'm sure it's more possible to live more in balance with nature if we reduce our demands, but not for everyone to have enough land to grow their own food. I mean, if you take, there's 60 million people in Britain, or more, and there's something like 8 or 10 million people in London, and if each of them had, you know, a hectare or two to grow their own food, well, you know, there isn't enough land.
Oh yeah.
So we can certainly live more in harmony with the planet if we reduce our demands, and if we, instead of throwing everything away and, you know, having to extract things, use them and throw them away. Even so-called recycling programs don't recycle that much. Most of it is burned here in Britain in incinerators. So we all lead enormously wasteful lives with far more than we actually need. But no government's going to get elected by saying we're offering you the chance of reducing your consumption and reducing your economic potential. That's what's actually happening, of course, in Europe. I mean, incomes are going down, at least in Britain. Incomes are going down, people are getting poorer. Yeah. And for the first time, generations of children realize they're never going to live as well as their parents. Whereas we've got used to the idea that children would do better than their parents, be richer, have better outcomes and so forth. Yeah. So we're already at a point of inflection where the tide is turning. But the whole of our political system is geared towards more and more economic growth and more products and stuff. That we haven't really got a system at the moment which is designed to reduce our impact by reducing our consumption.
Yeah, what are your expectations for the coming years?
Well, I mean, I think that obviously there's millions of doom scenarios around. I mean, we've all heard them. You know, there's so many things that could go wrong and are going wrong. I prefer to think of things that might go right, you know, and which would include more people discovering a life living more simply with more spiritual goals can be more satisfying and happier than a life of ever-increasing consumption. So I think a move towards a more spiritual way of thinking and living is one of my great hopes.
Yeah, we share that hope. And that's also what we're supporting. And we get that back from our audience, you know, that they're also in their own environments. And it's also more attractive because the happiness is more clear in that way, and people feel it instead of that it's a promise, a story.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe people are also a little bit tired of those false promises, and they discover that that's not what life is about. So I think there's also like a natural correcting mechanism in place. Like, we learn by doing, and we discover, okay, this is a dead-end street, and we take a side here, and we grow towards something else. So I can also see like a sacredness of everything here. Yeah. And it's also coming back to our view on time. Do you mind if I pose like a philosophy on that? And
no, please do.
I have a Bible verse on that, because you go to church, right?
Yes.
And I think there are so many undeniable statements in the Bible which have been very confusing, like strange, But now with new eyes, with a fresh look, it may be very insightful. So I don't know if I pronounce this correctly. Ecclesiastes, that Bible book.
Ecclesiastes, yes.
Ecclesiastes number in 3 verse 15, that goes about time. And it states, that which has been is now, and that which is to be has already been, and God shall seek that which is past. Yeah, that's quite a puzzle if you believe in linear time or in cyclic time. I think it's spiraling, but yeah, a few months ago I got this insight about what time really is. And that's also coming back about what Einstein, for instance, said about time, that time is an illusion, it's just a perception, but a very stubborn one. And I share that stubbornness because, you know, right before this talk we were outside and we were moving towards, so we have a clear experience of time. But what I now came to see is that it's constructed in this way, it's created in this way, from beginning to end. So the beginning of time and the end of time has already been in place, the whole universe, and that's growing in towards a vertical time. I don't know if you've heard these terms before, like horizontal time and vertical time. And I believe that we experience life in horizontal time, which is already there, but our soul goes through this experience. But when you step outside of it, like where God is or where angels are, they can see the whole picture already. So they can see, for instance, hey, a Messiah is coming. And, you know, Jesus came 2,000 years ago. So this time, and Jesus talked a lot about the completion of this world. And so the way I look at it now is it's not completing in a horizontal way, but it's completing in a vertical way. So we're growing and we learn by doing, and we have traumas and we heal our traumas to have a nicer life. So this horizontal timeline is growing towards a completion, and I don't believe in a big crunch that you mentioned. And if I would say where it's all going to, what comes to mind is what the Tibetan monks, what they make with the sand, the colored sand, they make these mandalas. Or mandalas, I don't know how to pronounce, but beautiful. And once it's ready, it's all crystallized and it's perfect, then they begin all over. So that's a little bit my understanding of time. And so it's not one-dimensional, it's two-dimensional. We have an experience in one dimension, but God lives in another dimension. And that's also what a lot of spiritual practices state, that God can be found in the moment. That's where true life is. And time is an illusion. So everything starts to make sense when I look at it in that way. And, you know, I've been really looking forward to this talk, to post this with you. And just to pick your brain on what do you feel like? Where do you feel like reluctance or what do you think? What do you think about this?
Well, I mean, the idea of the horizontal and the vertical makes sense to me. I think horizontal time is not illusory. I think the universe is expanding, which is creating more time, as it were, as it does that. I think that time is asymmetric. Einstein's block universe was completely symmetric, and the reason for that is that Einstein was a Platonist, and he believed that the mathematical laws, the mathematical reality, these abstract ideas of maths are timeless. Platonic forms are timeless. So I think one of the confusions in Western science is precisely that this vertical time, the timeless or eternal dimension, has been incorporated into our model of nature through timeless mathematical laws and constant constants and the block universe and stuff. There's been a kind of introduction of eternity inappropriately into horizontal time. That I think that the actual process of expansion of the universe is asymmetric. It's expanding, not contracting. The growth of an embryo from a fertilized egg into an adult organism is a one-way process. You don't see it going the other way. Old people don't grow down and become embryos.
Yeah.
Embryos grow up and become old eventually. That there's a kind of irreversibility in many processes, that nature is a process, and process has a difference between the past and the future. We have memories of the past and anticipations or hopes or desires or intentions for the future, but they're different. So I think time, horizontal time, is not an illusion. I think it's very real. I think it's the way nature works. There's asymmetry in time, which is reflected in quantum theory too. The Schrödinger wave equation that describes what will happen to an electron or any other particle describes all the possible things that could happen. As soon as it interacts with something or is measured, all these possibilities collapse down to a defined fact that you can measure. It's called the collapse of the wave function, and then new possibilities open up, and those then collapse down. So you've got a kind of opening possibilities in the future, which then become facts, which are then in the past. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead was very keen on this point of view, that the mental pole is the future pole, and the physical pole is the past pole. The relation of mind and body is not spatial, the inner and the outer, the usual way we think of it, but rather the mental pole is the future pole and the physical pole is the past pole. They're related in time. And so he thought the mind was concerned with future and choices among future actions. In other words, embedded in future possibilities. And the main function of consciousness is to choose among these possibilities. As soon as you've chosen, then it becomes a measurable physical fact. Like it's a measurable physical fact that you and I are sitting here now. But, we could have chosen to do other things this morning. We didn't. So it's a measurable physical fact. It's being measured and recorded on cameras and things. So, but we're also, at the same time, our minds are opening to new future possibilities. And so the mental pole is always about the future and possibility. But it's to do with possible actions. It's all to be embedded. It's all about being embedded in time and process. But as you said, there's also this vertical aspect, which comes about through mystical experiences most powerfully, where people feel that their mind is part of something much greater than themselves, sharing in some kind of divine or more than human consciousness, which goes way beyond our normal consciousness, and which gives the impression of being timeless or not in time as we normally know it. And people can arrive at mystical experiences spontaneously. I mean, lots of people have them spontaneously, even as children, or they can arrive at them through spiritual practices, or through psychedelic experiences, or through near-death experiences. There are people have these experiences of being part of a much larger consciousness, which is not in the kind of time we normally know. And that I think that's what gave rise to the Platonic, the Platonic philosophy, I think, arose from mystical experience, the intuition there's something beyond time. But then it was turned into a philosophy and maths, and then applied to nature in a way that's not to do with experience, the direct experience, but as a kind of formula for the way nature is governed by eternal laws. So I think originally Plato probably arrived at this idea of an eternal reality. In fact, all the ancient Greek philosophers were preoccupied with the idea that there's an eternal reality beyond this world, which doesn't change. And I think that original insight must have come from mystical experience. I mean, after all, they had the Eleusinian mysteries that many of the leading Greeks went to in the cave in Eleusis, the temple in Eleusis, where they took a psychedelic brew, which some people think contained ergot or purified forms of ergot, a bit like LSD, which is derived from the fungus ergot. And that there was a strong mystical element in Greek thought. And So anyway, I think that this vertical dimension, this which is experienced through mystical experience, which is the ground of all religions start from this experience of connection with something greater than the human level. And the Buddha became enlightened not by doing a PhD, but by sitting meditating under trees. And and the ancient rishis of India, the seers, who wrote the Upanishads or dictated them, were sitting in caves meditating for years, like Tibetan monks do now. And Jesus didn't get his vision of being the Son of God through studying in a rabbinical seminary. He got it through a direct mystical experience at the moment of his baptism, according to the New Testament.
Yeah.
And so this sense of direct connection is what underlies all religions, and which ultimately they're about.
Yeah, yeah. And then we start to give words to it, and then we start to misunderstand each other.
Yes, oh yes. But within all religions, there's the possibility of, connecting with that original vision as well. I mean, in medieval Europe was full of monasteries, and in them some were Trappist monasteries, and people spent hours and hours praying every day and meditating, contemplative prayer.
Yeah.
As in the Orthodox Church, there are all these monks on Mount Athos, and so there's always been a strong, and Tibetan monks in monasteries and in caves, Tibetan rishis. There've always been some people who are within all religions who are mystics and who keep that tradition alive.
Yeah.
And lots of ordinary people who do as well.
Yeah, and I'm very grateful for it. It's like a time capsule for wisdom and beautiful insights. And about what you said earlier, that we co-create our own world, our own future. Like I have, this view on money, but what money does to society. It's such a conditional aspect of life, of our society. And in one of your books, I read about gratitude. That gratitude, it's sucked out of society because we use money. We feel entitled to something we buy, and we don't really feel the gratitude to it. That was very insightful. Yeah, what is your view on the concept of money? So not about the monetary system, because that's already enough said about inflation and all these things, but just the simple aspect of money or trade. Like what future are we co-creating if we don't really see this whole thing of money through? Like, what is it? What does it do? What is your view on that?
I haven't thought that much about it. But I mean, money started off as being sacred. Juno was the goddess of money in Rome, and money was, money was a kind of sacred thing. It was often made of gold. I mean, of precious metals, which themselves were associated with the sacred because they were precious. But money's become increasingly secularized and has lost any trace of the sacred. And now, of course, it's simply made up. I mean, the very fact people could make up cryptocurrencies and the fact that quantitative easing can happen, banks just press a button and billions of euros or pounds or dollars are just created as if by magic. It's quite clearly become something that's basically in our minds. It's no longer, bags of coins of actual precious metal. It's abstract things in computers and computer systems. Personally, I use cash whenever possible, and I don't particularly want our whole economic system to be virtualized. Apart from anything else, it would make us very vulnerable in the event of any conflict. The first thing hostile hackers would do is bring down the internet, and then the entire economic system would be paralyzed. No one would be able to buy vegetables at a stall in the street or food or anything, because their credit cards or phones wouldn't work. And so whereas cash is much more resilient. So actually, I take a sort of slightly, I think if we had more cash, then people would have a greater sense of it having some kind of physical reality or anchoring in the physical, which gold coins anchor money to, and even plastic euro or pound notes anchor it to something physical, even if it's the value of the note has got nothing to do with the fraction of a cent worth of plastic in it. It's something, again, it's completely in our minds.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know enough about economics and the financial system to speculate on the future of it, but I don't think we're going to get rid of money because it's been a means of exchange for such a long time. It's so deeply embedded into our system.
Well, it calls upon a mission for me then. Because I really feel that what you say is true. Like we are the ones who are creating this society and the future. And it's up to us. Like it's our gift, this whole creation. And we can steer. And there's so much to say about money, the conditional aspect of it. It's an eccentric motivation instead of an intrinsical one. And there's so many things to say about it. So thank you for giving your views on that. And I also really appreciated that you are like a true researcher. You know, you stick to your own subjects that you know about. And like with the money, it's not your area of expertise. And I think we live in a time where so many like gurus, they get the stage and they get a lot of respect and people start to ask all sorts of questions to them. And then they also start to give answers to all sorts of questions. And I see that, that's just another trap that we want to avoid. So I really appreciate your being so like a true researcher. And I want to thank you in general for this, for having us and for this conversation. And I like to ask if you have something to add as a last statement that you want to give.
Well, I suppose that I think since I've written 2 books actually on science and spiritual practices, first is called Science and Spiritual Practices, which you mentioned. The second is called Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, which is about 7 more spiritual practices. Since I think these are very helpful, I suppose one thing I would say is, that it's worth anyone who doesn't have spiritual practices taking 1 or more practices up. And for people who do, say people who meditate, then to look into the possibility of other ones, because it's not either or. You can have many different practices. And one of the ones that I find is most transformative, simplest and most fun is pilgrimage. And so I don't know what the situation is in the Netherlands because I've never been on a pilgrimage there, but there are holy places everywhere in Europe. And I mean, there are plenty in the Netherlands. And the key thing that we, in the British Pilgrimage Trust, of which I'm a patron, is that they should be on foot. And, one should go to the holy place with an intention to give thanks or to ask for something. Or, this is very different from just going for a walk because you're going with an intention. So and a pilgrimage can just be a few hours. It can easily take place in a single day. So it doesn't involve having to buy lots of heavy camping equipment and booking tickets to go somewhere near Santiago to start on the Camino. It can be something much simpler. And I think it's a way of re-sacralizing the landscape and re-sacralizing our lives. And so something I'm very keen on and I'd recommend to anyone who's interested in trying something new if they haven't already tried it.
Absolutely. Well, I was reading your book and I noticed that I'm doing all of the spiritual practices except this one. So it's a good reminder for me to try it. So by foot you go towards like a cathedral or a church,
Yes.
or a sacred place in nature, or ley lines, or
Yes.
whatever you feel attraction towards, and you go there with a clear intention.
Yes. And traditionally you'd make an offering of some kind. I mean, if it's a cathedral, then, making some offering. If you go to a Hindu temple, you take flowers or coconut or something. So you make some offering to give thanks for the place. And then, with an intention of linking to the place. And our pilgrimage routes in Britain, which are on a website called britishpilgrimage.org, include cathedrals, churches, holy wells, the sources of rivers, mountain tops. I mean, traditionally people have always found some mountain tops or sources of rivers or springs, important holy places.
Yeah.
And some cathedrals are built on ancient holy places. Here in Britain, Wells Cathedral, for example, is next to 7 wonderful springs that come out of the ground. They're right at the east end of the cathedral.
Yeah.
And it's called wells because these are wells. So many of these cathedrals, and Chartres is built over a sacred well. It's in the crypt of the cathedral. So many of them are actually built on traditional sacred places. So it's a matter of rediscovering those places when in Protestant countries pilgrimage was suppressed at the Reformation. And so in Catholic countries it wasn't. So in Protestant countries like Britain, pilgrimage was made illegal in 1538.
Oh, wow.
And it's only recently, in the 20th century, began again. I think that the reason the British invented tourism was because they couldn't be pilgrims anymore. And I think tourism was a form of secularized pilgrimage. And I think when you see tourism as secularized or even more frustrated pilgrimage, because people go to the great sacred places, the temples of Egypt, the temples of India, the cathedrals of Europe, etc., as tourists. But then they have to pretend they're there because they're interested in art history or architectural history. And most people aren't very interested in they don't really care what year it was built in. They're going because it's a great sacred place. But because they've secularized people, they think they've got to go there and pretend to be Enlightenment rationalist intellectuals. They have to pretend they're interested in all these facts. And they can't sort of kneel down and say a prayer or light a candle. But if one can go in the spirit of a pilgrim and light a candle and say a prayer and just be in that space and be open to the space and the tradition, it's a completely different and much more satisfying experience. So I think the revival of pilgrimage, particularly in countries that have been traditionally Protestant, is like a paradigm shift and is very transformative in the way we relate to the place as well as our own lives.
Yeah, wow. Well, thank you very much for that last addition. Yeah. All right. So, I hope you have enjoyed this episode, although it was in English, but hopefully the subtitles have helped. If so, please give it a like and leave a comment. That way it goes up in the ratings so new people can discover the podcast and gain benefits from it. You can subscribe to this channel, visit our website, tijdboeklumens.nl. And below the video you can also find a few links towards the britishpilgrimage.org, which was mentioned, also a link to the video of the band TED Talk, which is really interesting, and towards a few books of Rupert Sheldrake. All right, thank you very much and see you next time.